Well, hello and welcome to my camper van. This week's assembly comes from inside my camper van, a place I often come to get a bit of peace and quiet. And the reason for that is that outside it is so miserable and rainy and wet that I can't do my normal outside jumping around. It's also because the theme of this week's assembly is actually quite a lot more serious than in previous weeks. And that's because this week we're going to look at the theme of Black Lives Matters and the protests that you will have seen going on around the world, particularly in America, but also in our own country. And I think it's really important at this time that we just get our heads around what this is all about, what's going on, and what does it mean for us. So hopefully a lot of you will be following this in the news, and you will know that this time, and this is a campaign that's been going on for a long time, but this time the whole thing has really blown up following the death of a black African American called George Floyd, who was killed by police in America, who choked him with a knee on his throat while arresting him for something he may or may not have done. That's irrelevant. The fact was that his life seemed not to matter. And this has led to huge protests around the world, trying to draw attention to what a lot of people who are black in this country, around the world, and particularly in America, are suffering at the moment. Now, to really understand this, we have to go back in time a bit. Now, some of you will think, oh, Mr. Bloor, he's absolutely ancient at the age of 53. But what I find surprising and shocking is two things. First of all, 100 years, or just over 100 years before I was born, slavery was allowed in huge parts of America. It only stopped in 1865. This means black people were taken from Africa by ships, transported to America, and forced to work on plantations there. And that only stopped just about 100 years before I was born. When I was born, in America, it was still perfectly possible to be discriminated against by the law. The law only changed in America to give full rights to people from all backgrounds, black or white, when I was 1 year old. Before that, it was completely possible to not be allowed to go to certain schools, be in certain places, rent certain properties, live in certain areas, just because you were black. That's quite recent. And it was the work of people like Martin Luther King in the 1960s that led to that civil rights movement, and for those civil rights being granted to all members of American society. And for a time, it seemed that things were getting better. And for me, in my lifetime, the most emotional part of that story that I remember is just 12 years ago, when Barack Obama was elected as the first black president of America. And I remember staying up all night to see the results of that election come in. And through the night, it became clearer and clearer that this amazing moment in history was happening, when a black American, people who only about 150 years previously had been slaves, could suddenly become President of America. And that was a time of great hope, and a time when we thought a change was really going to come. Sadly, in the years since then, not all the changes have happened that needed to happen. And in some cases, many people feel that things have gone backwards and things have gone worse. And that has all come to a head in the last few weeks following the killing of this black African American. Now, I don't want to spend this assembly talking too much. I've said enough already. I would like to pass on to Barack Obama, and I would like you to listen what he has to say on these issues. In 2015, and he's speaking at the funeral of the Reverend Pinckney, who was a pastor, a vicar, a preacher, who was shot in a racist attack at his church back in 2015. And Obama went to the funeral and spoke there. And what he talks about is grace. Now, grace It's one of those words in English which has lots and lots of different meanings. But in this sense, what Obama talks about is grace in the sense of generous giving love, of giving everything of yourself freely. And he says that this is what is needed in our society. He talks about being full of empathy and fellow feeling, full of understanding for other people, being able to walk in somebody else's shoes and see through their eyes. And I think that it's more than anything at the moment, that is what we need, the ability to see things through other people's eyes. You personally may not be affected by racism. And you may think, well, my life matters, all lives matter. Of course they do. But at the moment what we're saying is that there are lots of people who, just because they're black, are treated in a bad way, are not listened to, don't feel part of our society, and we need to understand that and listen to that. The speech is worth watching for the full 40 minutes, but I'm just going to show you one or two bits of it.
I cannot claim to have had the good fortune to know Reverend Pinckney well, but I did have the pleasure of knowing him back when we were both a little bit younger. Back when I didn't have visible gray hair. The first thing I noticed was his graciousness. Reverend Pinckney embodied a politics that was neither mean nor small. Amen. He conducted himself quietly and kindly and diligently. He was full of empathy and fellow feeling, able to walk in somebody else's shoes and see through their eyes. Amen. What a good man. This whole week I've been reflecting on this idea of grace. Grace. As a nation, out of this terrible tragedy, God has visited grace upon us. For he has allowed us to see where we've been blind. He's given us the chance where we've been lost to find our best selves. But it is up to us now to make the most of it. For too long we've been blind to the way past injustices continue to shape the present. Perhaps this tragedy causes us to ask some tough questions about how we can permit so many of our children to languish in poverty, or attend dilapidated schools, or grow up without prospects for a job or for a career. Perhaps it causes us to examine what we're doing to cause some of our children to hate. Perhaps it softens hearts towards those lost young men, tens and tens of thousands caught up in the criminal justice system, and lead us to make sure that that system's not infected with bias, that we embrace changes in how we train and equip our police so that the bonds of trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve make us all safer and more secure. By recognizing our common humanity, by treating every child as important, regardless of the color of their skin or the station into which they were born, and to do what's necessary to make opportunity real for every American. By doing that, we express God's grace. But it would be a betrayal of everything Reverend Pinckney stood for, I believe, if we allowed ourselves to slip into a comfortable silence again. You're right. To go back to business as usual. You're right. That's what we so often do. To avoid uncomfortable truths about the prejudice that still infects our society. Where we shout instead of listen. Clem understood that justice grows out of recognition. of ourselves in each other. He knew that the path of grace involves an open mind, but more importantly, an open heart. That's what I felt this week, an open heart. That, more than any particular policy or analysis, is what's called upon right now, I think. What a friend of mine, the writer Marilyn Robinson, calls that reservoir of goodness. That reservoir of goodness. If we can find that grace, anything is possible. If we can tap that grace, everything can change. Amazing grace. Amazing grace. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Clement of Picnic found that grace. May we find ourselves worthy of that precious and extraordinary gift. As long as our lives endure. May grace now lead them home. May God continue to shed His grace on the United States of America.
So I hope you found that speech as inspirational as I did. I find it incredibly moving. I hope to see you again next week, and by that time I hope that the sun will have come out again and that I'll be back outside to entertain you.